Hi, this is Dr. Ken Owen with Pierce College here for another video for Music Off the Record. We're going to be talking about Mozart, particularly Mozart's later life as we're talking about his Requiem. Now Mozart, of course, most people know him as the iconic child prodigy. His title there, his full name is there on the slide. Most of that we don't typically hear. We usually hear just Wolfgang Amadeus, which isn't even listed in there, Mozart. So, but what about his adult life? Once he's past the child prodigy star days? Well, a little more typical, I guess, in some aspects, that there's family drama with him and his parents, him and his own family. There's financial up and downs, and tragically that adult life doesn't last too long. He gets sick and dies at age 35. So this whole, I guess what we'll think of as adult life starts really when he gets away from Salzburg when he's 25 years old. He heads to Vienna seeking freedom from the restraints that he felt in Salzburg there, and of course to make a living there. He doesn't move there with a job as a court composer or any other organization. He's intending to be a freelance composer, which at the time was unheard of, very risky. Father certainly unapproved, but he had the guts to do it anyway. Well, at first it worked out really well. The Viennese just loved him. He was very successful. And as that success comes, he of course begins to spend that money. He lives very expensively. He keeps moving into more expensive housing, living with more and more of what he wants. But eventually the Mozart craze in Vienna wears off, and then the financial struggles begin. But thank goodness Mozart did inherit some of his father's business savvy and managed to find ways to make things work. He figured out that he'd make more money from concerts if he was the one that was putting on the concert, organizing it. So he starts his own subscription concert series. That's what a lot of his piano concertos were written for. And that works for a while, but in the next slide it says it's not enough to keep up. The audience in Vienna is fickle. They want to hear the next new composer. And it's difficult to keep things going. So to make ends meet, he begins to travel more, to tour and perform, and try to get his music performed elsewhere. One place in particular that was successful for him was Prague. Prague loved Mozart, but Prague was a lot smaller city than Vienna. It was a good source of income, but Mozart knew that it was not enough to sustain, so he never moved there. It was a good place to bring in some additional from touring. The map here will show you about what kind of a trip that was. It doesn't seem that big of a deal today with our modern transportation possibilities, but Mozart would have been not much faster than on foot. I mean, even if he was horse and carriage. So a good 60 hours walk from Vienna to Prague. So it was a bit of a trek. So let's go ahead and skip forward to the last couple of months of his life and what's happening around the composition of this Requiem. Last couple of months of his life, he's working on two operas, The Magic Flute, or Die Zauberflöte, which he was composing to be premiered in Vienna, and La Clemenza di Tito, or The Clemency of Titus, which was intended for Prague. While he's working on these, he gets commissioned to write a Requiem. Now, we're talking end of the summer, beginning of fall. He was in Prague working with the opera there, and became sick, was sick quite a bit. He seems to be feeling better, at least it sounds that way from letters that he's writing to his wife. He comes back to Vienna, but in November he gets sick again, so much so that he's confined to bed. And of course the illness never recovers. There's a tragic loss to the musical world when Mozart dies that December in 1791. When he dies, it's recorded, the cause recorded is severe military fever. Later that was changed to rheumatic inflammatory fever. Since then there's been lots of speculation about other things that it could have been, taking account of medical history. There was a syndrome proposed that I'd never heard of before, and other things as well. One thing for sure though, it was not poisoning, despite any of the movies that you've seen. It was not poison. Mozart was survived by his wife, Constanze, and by two sons. They had 6 babies, only 2 of them survived past infancy. When Mozart died, he really wasn't a big deal. He had, again, had those ups and downs with popularities, but the concept of a musician of the day certainly was still that of a mostly a servant. Were not big celebrities at this point. So his funeral was not a big deal. It was attended by a small group of friends and family. He was buried in a mass, unmarked grave. We don't know exactly where the grave is that Mozart was buried in. This really was not that unusual, given the social status of a musician and his current financial status, which was not great. Mozart's music also didn't go on to be a big deal after his death. For the most part, public was interested at that point in hearing what was new. As we moved into more of the era of Schubert and Beethoven, that's what audiences wanted to hear, is the new things. However, some of his operas did continue to be performed. In particular, The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni. It's interesting to note both of those are quite pointed criticism in their subject in the text of royalty, and both of them kind of express this feeling of the common man that royalty is taking advantage of everybody, and there's a kind of unhappiness with that. Part of perhaps the gradual build towards all the revolutions, including the French Revolution, that happened in the next century after Mozart. So there's really a revival of interest in the 20th century of Mozart's music. That's when a lot of his music begins to be performed again, and to the point where he's one of our most popular composers of classical music today. People who don't really listen to classical music, they know the name Mozart, and they probably know some of his tunes. Well, the anniversary of Mozart's death was the very inspiration for Northwest Sinfonietta. The orchestra started in 1991 as a celebration of that anniversary. And so that's kind of the surroundings. This was happening at the end of Mozart's life, and now watch the video on the Requiem to find out more details of exactly what happened with that commission.